Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Let's take a look at tonight's top stories. The government unveils its mid-year budget update, boasting they're within distance of a second surplus. But this surplus is built on $30 billion of higher than expected income taxes from struggling families, all during a cost of living crisis. I'll chat about this with Steve Price in a moment. Meanwhile, Victorian police are gearing up to arrest a seventh former immigration detainee as Labor comes under more pressure over this ongoing scandal. Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan will join me later. And the producer of the project is grilled in the Bruce Lehrmann defamation trial, denying accusations he ignored inconsistencies in Brittany Higgins' story. Our court reporter Julia Bradley will give us the latest. But first, the Albanese government today split with the United States and voted with the UN to demand Israel call off its war against Hamas and instead agree to a ceasefire. Here's Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong announcing this today.
Australia shares the grave concerns that I have articulated previously about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Human suffering is widespread and it is unacceptable. Australia continues to condemn the ongoing acts of terror by Hamas, its use of human shields, its use of civilian infrastructure to launch attacks on Israel. We again reiterate our demand, which is reflected in the resolution, that Hamas release all remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally. Australia has consistently affirmed Israel's right to defend itself, and in doing so we have said Israel must respect international humanitarian law.
This decision applauded by the left and rightly denounced by Jewish groups which have accused Albanese of trying to have it both ways on the war. The Zionist Federation of Australia and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry said in a joint statement that either the government stands by its position that recognises that Hamas must be removed from power and return all the hostages, or it supports a ceasefire which would allow Hamas to remain in power and deliver on its promise to repeat the attacks of 7th of October at the earliest possible opportunity. And the Zionist Federation President Jeremy Liebler would join me on the show a bit later. Unsurprisingly, Teal politician Zoe Daniel came out today to say that she also supports a ceasefire. She said in a statement that as winter comes to Gaza, the humanitarian crisis will worsen and Australia can't simply stand and watch. Well, Zoe Daniel pretended to be a friend of Israel during the election campaign. We now know her true colours. Well, in Israel on a bipartisan trip is Labor MP Josh Burns, and he disagreed with his own government's decision. He said that a premature peace settlement would allow the terror organisation to regroup and pose an unacceptable ongoing threat to Israel. Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham is also on the trip with Josh Burns, and he had this to say.
It is one thing to be saying that you want a ceasefire, but the terms are the critical aspect there, and the terms have to be that Hamas releases all hostages, Hamas surrenders all arms, Hamas hands over its leadership and its terrorist operatives, and that ultimately Hamas is completely disabled.
Liberal MP Julian Leeser said that support for a ceasefire only prolongs Hamas's hold in Gaza instead of ensuring its days are numbered.
It prolongs Hamas remaining in power. This is a war about removing an organisation from power that we have listed as a terrorist organisation for several years in our own country. An organisation that murdered 1,200 Jewish people, the largest murder of Jews on a single day since the Holocaust. All this will do is keep Hamas in power. All this does is give Hamas time to consolidate and time to remain in power. The government has made this change because there has been a campaign in this country by the extreme Greens and their allies in inner city seats. This is more about Graindler than it is about Gaza.
He makes an excellent point that the government's caving in to the extremism. I mean, not that long ago, it was only the Greens who were calling for a ceasefire. Now, it's Australia's official foreign policy position. Well, let's be very clear about what Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese are actually supporting when they side with the United Nations in demanding a ceasefire. Australia now supports a call for Israel to withdraw while its citizens are still being drugged and abused, while they're held hostage in dark underground tunnels, and while Hamas is still the governing body in Gaza, intent on destroying Jews. This decision today tells us that Australia, under Albanese and Wong, is a fair-weather friend of Israel. In its darkest hour, Australia has walked away from our closest ally in the Middle East. It's not just the darkest hour for Israel, but for Jews around the world. And at this moment of heartache, as the Jewish homeland came under unprecedented and unprovoked attack from a group that continues to repeat its aim to destroy Jews around the world, Australia under Albanese hasn't stood in our corner. Instead of having the moral fortitude to support Israel as it seeks to destroy the terrorists who invaded the homes of innocent families on October 7, Albanese, in demanding a ceasefire, has now meekly sided with terrorist sympathisers who want Israel to retreat and lay down arms. A move that will only have one repercussion: the emergence of a stronger and more emboldened Hamas regime. A murderous regime that will be fortified by the support of the United Nations, where an international coalition, in a state of moral confusion, has buttressed a barbaric genocidal group instead of giving strength to the peace-abiding democracy that is trying to defeat it in an increasingly lonely battle. This is stupidity from Albanese and Wong, with Albanese showing himself to be a more feeble leader than we could have imagined. And he's not alone. Even US President Joe Biden expressed concern overnight about Israel's approach, blaming Israel for losing support from the rest of the world. He had this to say as he stood alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
We have made it clear to the Israelis, and they're aware, that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern. And so the actions they're taking must be consistent with attempting to do everything possible to prevent innocent Palestinian civilians from being hurt.
And of course, Israel is taking every possible action to protect civilian life. Let's articulate the moral reality here. In the same way that the West couldn't have agreed to a ceasefire with the Nazis, there cannot be a ceasefire with Hamas. The Nazi and Hamas regimes are equally as barbaric and murderous. If left unchecked, Hamas will only strengthen and grow. Its victims will increase in number. We all said never again after the Holocaust, and now is that time, never again. Western leaders like Albanese, and he's not alone, they need to have the courage, the clarity to say never again, and to stand with Israel and innocent Palestinians as the IDF defeats this terror group. I think it's important to revisit the speech today that the new US President Harry Truman gave at the San Francisco conference in April 1945, which was when the UN Charter was created. With high hopes for the United Nations, President Truman said that the new body would speak for people who've endured the most savage and devastating war ever inflicted upon innocent men, women, and children. He was, of course, speaking about the Holocaust, and of course he meant the Jewish people. He said, and I quote, "We must prevent, in human mind, heart, and hope can prevent it. If human mind, heart, and hope can prevent it, the repetition of the disaster from which the entire world will suffer for years to come. If we should pay merely lip service to inspiring ideals and later do violence to simple justice, we would draw down upon us the bitter wrath of generations yet unborn. We must not continue to sacrifice the flower of our youth merely to check madmen, those in who in every age plan would domination. The sacrifices of our youth today must lead, through your efforts, to the building for tomorrow of a mighty combination of nations founded upon justice, on peace. Yet the United Nations has today sided with the terror group, which is desperate for a ceasefire. Hamas is desperate for a ceasefire. It sided with Hamas rather than with Israel that is trying to defeat Hamas in order to preserve the peace. With Australia's support, the United Nations calls for Israel to lay down its arms against those who've committed crimes against the peace. As we speak about the United Nations and its failings, I want to return to the eloquence of the former OECD economist, Henry Ergas, who wrote of the United Nations that the God of our dreams is also the God of our nightmares. He wrote in one of my favourite columns of his in The Australian that the UN's aspirations have gone up in flames. And he makes this vital, vital point. As the United Nations descends into irrelevance, the laws of war, which were intended to protect the innocent, are being used to shelter the terrorists who deliberately place them at risk. Hailed as a triumph of civilization, they have become a tool facilitating barbarism's relentless advance. That leaves the people of Israel once again facing the fearfulness, the sense of danger, the perception of the struggle's ultimate character. Henry Ergas says that the appeasers confuse a moral equivalence between victims and executioners, and he says that the Albanese government compounds this moral confusion. He says the single-minded focus on Israel obscures the atrocities that Hamas commits day after day, including by indiscriminately shelling Israeli homes, schools and hospitals. And Henry Ergas writes that the Albanese government's lack of clarity has the opposite effect. By relentlessly blurring the line between right and wrong, it gives Hamas's supporters a legitimacy that they don't deserve, and it fuels radicalisation that's tearing us apart. He writes, in the end, national unity demands moral direction, not moral equivocation. So too does our ability to face the future. For the unhinging of the nation's moral compass doesn't merely extinguish the courage to speak the truth, it erases the courage needed to see it. In a world that is far from being at peace, and where devastating cataclysms are not simply the painful memories of the old, but looming threats to the young, that doesn't just blind, it kills. We need to be clear. The devastation in Gaza is solely the responsibility of Hamas. Hamas planned the October 7 attacks for at least a year. It knew Israel would be forced to respond to defend its people, and Hamas deliberately interwove its terrorist infrastructure within the civilian population. It placed its weapons beneath hospitals and schools in its hope that the death toll of Palestinians, its own people, would be high to win over the sympathy of the international community. Hamas planned to rely on that international sympathy in order to wage war against Jews. The international coalition voting for a ceasefire at the United Nations is playing into the hands of Hamas. Worse, it's advancing its war strategy. The threat Hamas poses is not just to Jews, but to all of Western civilization, to the very values we have fought for and lost lives for over generations. Hamas's bloodthirsty leaders have made it clear that it won't stop at Israel. Its goal is to spread its extremist rule throughout the West. Well, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down his mid-year update today, announcing that the deficit for this financial year has been reduced from $13.9 billion to just $1.1 billion. He said a second surplus was within striking distance.
We are not yet forecasting a second surplus, but we are within striking distance. We have given ourselves a chance, but we aren't there yet, and we've been deliberately cautious and deliberately conservative.
So why is the government in such a good budget position? Well, the Australian Financial Review reports that there's been tax revenue surge of almost $65 billion since May. And along with a delay in infrastructure spending, this has boosted the budget bottom line by $39.6 billion over the 4-year forward estimates. Political editor in the Fin Review, Phil Curry, reports that given the speed at which tax revenue's pouring in, it's likely this financial year will record a surplus. He writes that the tax receipt uplift is due predominantly to personal income taxes being $30 billion higher than forecast, including $9 billion for this financial year, and company tax receipts being $34.5 billion higher over the next 4 years, and $9.2 billion higher for this financial year. Well, let's bring in now to discuss this Sky News host, Steve Price. Steve, look, the government boasting about these figures, good on them that it looks like there's going to be a surplus. Spending could have been higher. There are criticisms today, however, that not enough was done to cut spending. And as Phil Curry wrote in the Fin Review, there's $30 billion higher personal income taxes than was forecast. So this potential surplus looks like it'll come at the expense of failing to tackle bracket creep and higher taxes for Australians.
Yeah, I don't think too many Australians watching Sky tonight, looking at Jim Chalmers smiling through that media conference today, would be all that happy about that. I mean, this obsession with surpluses is something that Labor desperately wants, because they can then go to the next election and say, look, the opposition says we can't manage money. Look at us, we've had 2 surpluses. They couldn't have one during their last term of government. So it's all about the politics. And when you talk about those numbers, those figures, I mean, who's doing those estimates in Treasury? How do you get it that wrong? I mean, it's quite ridiculous that the figures could be that out of whack. And, you know, we've prosecuted this argument. Paul Murray's done it a lot. There was nothing there today in my EFO to give any relief to cost of living. The people tonight are struggling home. They're stopping at a petrol station. Petrol's still pretty high. It's come down a little bit. You know, the excise could easily be put away for 6 months. But what Jim Chalmers did today, Sharri, I think is he said, look, we've made a lot of money. We're going to stick it away. Maybe we'll give you some next year, but you go to Christmas and that's your bad luck.
Look, let's have a look at Queensland now. An exclusive in The Australian today reveals that Steve Miles was installed as Queensland's next Labor Premier because of a secret industrial deal done between 2 unions over government-funded infrastructure projects. The report says that both the United Workers' Union and the Australian Workers' Union were involved in king-making decisions, according to sources briefed on the negotiations. Miles today denied having any role in Anastasia Palaszczuk's resignation. He held a press conference. He was quite fiery when he was asked about the role of the unions. He said that unions are simply the bodies representing tens of thousands of workers. Steve, what do you think about these reports in The Australian about the way he came to power?
I love the way Jonathan Lee stuck it to him today too. He was very uncomfortable. I don't think Stephen Miles is going to handle the media particularly well, particularly when they're a bit aggressive. He's clearly done a deal with the unions and he's been caught out, and now the details have emerged of exactly what that'll do. And it's modelled on what Daniel Andrews did with the Victorian government, where he would do deals with the unions, and all of these big infrastructure projects that you see in Victoria and in Queensland now, they're going to be manned by union workers who are going to get really well paid. And so the unions are looking after their union members and they're using governments to help them do it. I don't think it's a great start for Stephen Miles. I think Queenslanders who were sick of Anastasia Palaszczuk are going to wake up pretty quickly to this bloke.
Now, another big story today, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price has accused Albanese of ignoring Indigenous issues ever since his Voice to Parliament referendum failed. She said that we haven't heard from him since the failing of the Voice on any issues regarding Indigenous Australians, our most marginalised. She says it's disappointing that the Prime Minister appears to have abandoned this issue altogether. Steve, what do you think about this? She does seem to have a point.
I think she's the most honest politician in the country at the moment. She says what she believes. She's not afraid to speak out, and she makes a lot of sense. We know that Anthony Albanese, he did one whistle stops tour to Alice Springs at the height of all the trouble they were having in the streets. Now, if any Australians watching us tonight don't believe that trouble still goes on in Alice Springs, you're kidding yourselves. And so Jacinta is putting on the record again that nothing's happened. And it's not just Anthony Albanese. Sharri, when was the last time we heard from any of the vocal Indigenous leaders who are out every day during the Voice campaign about anything? We haven't heard anything from a peep from them either. So suddenly you lose the yes vote and you're pretending that all these problems for Indigenous communities, and look at what's going on in Townsville as an example, you're just pretending they've all gone away. I mean, it's pretty pathetic, and the Prime Minister needs, the next time he has a media conference, to be asked about her comments today.
Look, just finally, Steve, what do you think about this prospect that a lot of the political commentators are writing about, that the Prime Minister might be a one-term government, that if they win next time, they could be in minority government, but even that they say it's looking like he could just be a one-term government? There have been so many scandals in the second half of this year.
Yeah, I think Paul Kelly summed that up pretty well in The Australian today, where he said there's a lot of these marginal electorates that are getting very cranky. Now, the last thing we want to do is go back to minority government. I mean, I can still remember how horrible it was in 2010 when Julia Gillard tied with the coalition on 72 seats each. And you remember those days? You might have even been down in Canberra, where you had all those negotiations with Rob Oakeshott and with Tony Windsor and with Bob Katter to try and form some sort of cobbled together government. Can you imagine that happening again after the election we'll probably have in 2025 with the Teals and the government and the Greens? You imagine what sort of Australia we're going to end up with if that happens?
Well, exactly. And Steve, I mean, the Greens were a radical left group back then, 10 years ago, but now they're an anti-Semitic party, undoubtedly. They are an extremist party. You can't possibly form any sort of sensible government with the Greens.
No, you can't, and they'd have to. That's the only way that they could get the numbers if you go into minority government. So, look, in a sense, you'd rather that Labor won in its own right than have to go back to that sort of horse trading. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But if Peter Dutton keeps his nerve, you never know. Anthony Albanese might be a one-term Prime Minister. All
right, Steve Price, thank you so much for your time. Now, coming up, the producer of the project takes the stand in the Lehrmann defamation trial. He says he didn't seek comment from Bruce Lehrmann earlier because Higgins was worried the government would block the broadcast. We're going to get an update on this. We're also going to come back throughout the show to our top story tonight about the Albanese government's failure on Israel at the UN. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, Australia joined 152 nations to vote in favour of a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The vote comes a day after Israel brought back the bodies of 2 murdered hostages. I said at the start of the show that during Israel's darkest hour, the Albanese government has walked away from its right to defend itself, which means its right to exist, seeing as Hamas has repeatedly said it is intent on destroying Jews on Israel no longer existing. Well, joining me now is lawyer and president of the Zionist Federation of Australia, Jeremy Liebler. Jeremy, welcome to the program. What's your reaction to this move by Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese today, voting with the UN to demand Israel agree to a ceasefire?
Thanks, Sharri. Thanks for having me on the show. I woke up this morning to see a statement signed by Australia, Canada and New Zealand, which was pretty good. It condemned Hamas again, it called for the return of hostages, and it made it very clear that Hamas cannot be allowed to continue to control or operate in Gaza. Then, about half an hour later, I see that Australia has voted in favour of a UN resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Half an hour later, I see a statement issued by Australia's ambassador to the UN, James Larson, further clarifying why Australia voted in favour and that, in fact, it supports a ceasefire, but only a ceasefire that's agreed by both parties. So, Sharri, I'm very confused, and I suspect many in the international community are very confused as to what Australia's position actually is at the moment.
Look, You've pointed out in a statement today that Australia can't simultaneously support Israel's right to exist, but then also support calls for Israel to lay down its arms against the terror group, which is what a ceasefire effectively is. Is this why you say that the Albanese government can't have it both ways?
Well, supporting a ceasefire on the face of it sounds to the ordinary person as a reasonable thing. What decent person doesn't want a ceasefire? It means no more war, no more suffering. But the reality is, calling for a ceasefire now is a call and an expectation that Israel continue to live with a genocidal terrorist organisation sworn to its destruction that murdered 1,300 of its innocent civilians on the 7th of October, who have sworn to do so again, to live for another day and to repeat this, as well as the rocket fire that people in the south and in the north of Israel have had to live with. It's totally and utterly inconsistent with a position that Israel has the right to defend itself from barbaric terrorism as any other state would be expected to do so.
Look, this resolution that Australia agreed to was actually brought forward by the Arab grouping. How hypocritical is this Arab grouping, and what true atrocities is the entire United Nations, particularly the Arab grouping, turning a blind eye to?
The hypocrisy is staggering. Unfortunately, that's nothing new for the United Nations. But what's disappointing is that Australia has compromised its position as a respected middle power and to buy into this hypocrisy. This is something that the Greens would do. Where were the Greens? Where were all of these Arab countries when not 5,000, not 10,000, but over 100,000 people have been murdered in Saudi Arabia, in the context of Saudi Arabia and Yemen? Where are they? Where is the international community? We only seem to hear them when it involves Israel or the only Jewish state.
Absolutely, that's so right. Look, Penny Wong today said that the human suffering in Gaza is unacceptable. She says this is why Australia took this position. What's your response to her comments?
I fully agree that the human suffering that is going on in Gaza is totally unacceptable. It is horrific. And it is entirely on the conscience and the responsibility of Hamas, who started this war on the 7th of October. There was a ceasefire before the 7th of October. Hamas broke it and has committed themselves to repeating that atrocity over and over and again. Sharri, I was just in Israel 2 weeks ago. I saw the proximity of these kibbutzim to Gaza, a couple of kilometres. I saw where they broke into these kibbutzim, hundreds of Hamas terrorists, house to house, murdering, raping, pillaging and stealing, after which hundreds of Gazan civilians came in and proceeded to participate in the murder and the rape and the pillaging, before then stealing the toys and possessions of their murdered victims.
It's absolutely appalling, and to think that Australia has sided with those calling for Israel to retreat and allow this murderous regime to continue. Jeremy Liebler, thank you so much for your time. Now, the Daily Telegraph today revealed that Victorian police are preparing to arrest a seven former immigration detainee released after the High Court ruled that indefinite detention is unlawful. This is now the second case of a detainee who was released into the public without standing orders for their arrest. Labor's now under pressure to explain what checks were conducted on these convicted criminals before they were released. And Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan joins me now. Thank you very much for your time. Look, 7 now alleged reoffenders have been arrested. Is this getting out of control?
It is, and makes a complete mockery of the assurances that the Albanese government gave the Australian people that they wanted to keep them safe and were doing everything they can to keep them safe. It is now clear, and we have 2 examples, that they let these detainees go without doing the proper checks and balances and without seeing whether they had to let them go. They did it before the High Court had put its reasonings out, and they did it without checking whether there are other reasons, for instance, arrests or warrants out for some of these detainees, which would see them out behind bars. And once again, it just shows that Minister Giles and Minister O'Neill are not up to the job, and the Prime Minister should sack them. And the real worry is that over Christmas and New Year, the Australian people know that their safety has been compromised by this incompetent government, and they don't seem willing to even admit that they've got it wrong, they've completely mishandled it, and actually what should happen is both Ministers O'Neill and Giles should both go.
Look, it's clear that the government didn't have legislation ready to go in the case that the High Court was going to make this decision that indefinite detention was unlawful. There was no legislation ready to go. Do you think, therefore, that any alleged victims of the criminals who've now been released, do you think this is on the Albanese government's conscience?
Well, absolutely the government will need to take responsibility for anything that occurs, because not only weren't they ready to go when the High Court made its decision, but as we've now found out, once the legislation went through the Parliament after we forced the government to put legislation through, they still weren't ready to act. We found out yesterday that they set up a body to look at all the cases and then decide what will happen. We know that none of these decisions, that they won't go to the courts to try and get some of these people locked back up before Christmas. As a matter of fact, you know, we're very concerned that Minister O'Neill and Minister Giles will be nowhere to seen between now and Christmas and New Year, when they should be there working to do their job and make sure as many of these people are redetained as possible. This is just a government from the word go who has not taken its number one responsibility to heart, and that is keeping the Australian community safe.
And then there was also that story. We had the journalist Liam Mendes on the program last night. He's revealed that convicted terrorists were released, and that Mark Dreyfus didn't put in a request for a supervision order until just 3 days before one of them was released. But before you go, Dante, I also want to ask you about this decision that the Albanese government has taken to join with the United Nations in calling for a ceasefire from Israel. What do you think about that?
Well, it's the decision of a weak Prime Minister and a weak government. It's the decision of a Prime Minister that seems to have forgotten that Hamas is a listed terrorist organisation here in Australia, something that his own government has agreed to. It's a decision of a weak Prime Minister who seems to have forgotten what took place on the 7th of October, the murder, rape, kidnapping of 1,300 Israelis. It's the decision of a weak Prime Minister who voted one way in October and is now voting another way in December. It's the decision of a weak Prime Minister who doesn't understand the importance of social cohesion in this nation. And it's the decision of a weak Prime Minister who seems to have walked away from our key allies, the US and the UK, on a key UN vote. It beggars belief.
Completely agree. Dantian, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. A Network 10 producer has admitted to the federal court he didn't have proof that Brittany Higgins was told she'd lose her job if she went to police with her rape allegations before he put the claims to air on the project. Angus Llewellyn has denied he ignored inconsistencies in Brittany Higgins' story when questioned during Bruce Lehrmann's defamation trial against the Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson. Julia Bradley has been covering the trial in Sydney and joins us live. Julia, this producer, Angus Llewellyn, really was grilled today. He was pressed particularly on the fact-checking process that the project went through. What were the main revelations that we heard today?
Well, Sharri, wrapping up a second day in the witness box, Angus Llewellyn, this Network 10 producer, was questioned specifically over whether he properly checked the reliability and credibility of Ms Higgins' rape allegations before putting them to air on the project in 2021. Now, today, the court was taken to a pre-interview conversation that Mr Llewellyn had with journalist Lisa Wilkinson, Ms Higgins and her fiancé David Shiraz before this story went to air on the project. Now, in this recording, Ms Higgins can be heard asking Miss Wilkinson, should I say, can be heard asking Miss Higgins about a crucial meeting she had in the wake of her alleged rape. Now, Miss Wilkinson asks, "You were told you'd lose your job if you proceeded with the police charges," to which Miss Higgins replies, not explicitly, but it was clear it was, "You can proceed with this, we're not going to stop you, but you just don't have a job." Now, this is despite Miss Higgins also telling Miss Wilkinson in a separate instance that her former boss, Senator Linda Reynolds, and her Chief of Staff, Fiona Brown, expressed they'd support her if she went to police. Here was the exchange in court. So Bruce Lehrmann's barrister asking, "I want to suggest to you, Mr Llewellyn, that what she was saying was contradictory. Do you agree or disagree?" The producer responds, "I think once again your question is faulty. It's murky, opaque territory." To which Justice Lee then interjects. He says, "Are you saying that at the time the program was broadcast, you had, to use your words, no proof of an allegation that she was being told that if she proceeded with police charges, that she'd lose her job?" To which Mr Llewellyn replies, "I did not have proof, so yes." Now, Sharri, the court also heard that Prime Minister Scott Morrison's head of communications at the time called the network producer before the broadcast and provided him with a series of WhatsApp messages between Ms Higgins and Ms Brown in 2019, which seemingly contradicted Ms Higgins' claims. Now, Mr Llewellyn's evidence today has gone to Network 10's defence of qualified privilege. This refers to the publishing of defamatory statements in circumstances where the defamatory statements are reasonable and in the public interest. The network is also seeking to rely on a truth defence. Now, the next witness to take the stand tomorrow will be journalist Lisa Wilkinson, and Sharri, Mr Lehrmann has always denied the rape allegations.
Yeah, and we'll bring you tomorrow night all the news about what comes out of Lisa Wilkinson's evidence when she takes the witness stand. Thank you so much, Julia Bradley. Now, still to come, Cricket Australia is urging a player to drop his planned pro-Palestinian demonstration. Bridget McKenzie and Michael Danby would join me after this. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. The government says it's touching distance of a second surplus as the Treasurer unveils his mid-year budget report. Soon-to-be Queensland Premier Stephen Miles denies playing any role in the resignation of Anastasia Palaszczuk. Australia breaks ranks with the US and Israel on the floor of the United Nations, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The New South Wales government has reached an agreement with the Health Services Union that will see more than 5,000 New South Wales paramedics receive an average pay increase of 25% over 4 years. And Tropical Cyclone Jasper makes landfall in Queensland with damaging winds and very heavy rain hitting the northeast coast. Well, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has said that a second surplus is within striking distance in today's mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. But this surplus is built on $30 billion of higher than expected income taxes from struggling families during a cost of living crisis. Joining me now, former Labor MP Michael Danby and National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie. Welcome to you both. Bridget,
Hi.
Clearly, the fact that we're looking at a second surplus in a row is good news.
Well, obviously, surpluses are good news, Sharri. The fact that this is built on the backs of the taxes from Middle Australia and the resources industry, I think also bears mentioning. But what we haven't seen in this MyEFO is a reduction in government spending. The spending gradient is still on the rise, and that is precisely the wrong thing that needs to be occurring in a high inflationary environment. So the surplus is welcome. The fact that the government is planning to put a lot of it off the bottom line, again, tick. Unfortunately, the thing you need to do as a government to work hand in hand with the Reserve Bank is to actually reduce that spending, and unfortunately the spending keeps increasing. And I also note both the New South Wales and the Victorian governments are furious that the infrastructure cuts in this MyEFO have again caught them unawares. And whilst this government continues to pour, 600,000 people this 12 months alone into Melbourne and Sydney, they're not providing any additional funding to assist with the congestion that will cause.
Michael Danby, what do you think of the criticism today that the spending cuts haven't been great enough, and also particularly this figure that personal income taxes were $30 billion higher than forecast, this mostly because of bracket creep, and we're in a cost of living crisis?
I was astonished at the increases in personal income tax, and you're absolutely dead right, it's due to bracket creep, but Bridget hinted at the huge revenues that is going towards this projected budget surplus from the resources industries. We've got a bloke over in Doha, hilariously in a petro state, calling for the total abolition of fossil fuels. I mean, there are workers who work in the coal industry, in the gas industry, etc. When is Chris Bowen going to overcome this sort of mania that he has? I mean, and the Australia's able to afford all of its social security, etc., because of the vast money we get from coal, oil, and from natural gas.
Look, let's move on to...
It beggars belief, Michael.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Bridget.
I was just going to... Sorry, Sharri, I've just got back from COP and it was just incredible that one half of the government's, taking the credit for our highly successful resource industry while the other half of the government's seeking to shut it down. And I really just wanted to commend Michael for his comments.
Look, let's move on to the top story today. This is Australia voting with the United Nations to demand Israel agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. Michael Danby, clearly, this is Australia now siding with terrorist groups, with terrorist sympathisers, with useful idiots in the West who've been protesting on our streets in demanding that Israel retreats and allows the terror group to reinvigorate, to become emboldened and to continue to attack Israel and kill Jews.
Penny Wong says that Israel has a right to defend itself until it does. Now we call for a ceasefire before the Hamas depraved, demented killers and rapists are put down, and the Israelis are expected to live with this. This is just making for the next war, for the next conflict. If those Hamas madmen are left there under the control, like the Houthis and Hezbollah of Iran, the whole world will be put in peril further down the road. This is just kicking the can, and I can't believe how we didn't vote with the Austrians, the Dutch, the UK, Ukraine, Germany, and we abandoned our American allies. I'm sure Biden's very happy with elbow over this. Not.
Yeah. Look, I think the other point that I made earlier in the night, Bridget, is that actually this is part of Hamas's war strategy. It uses civilians as human shields so that it can get, this condemnation of Israel from the international community. So this UN vote is playing into Hamas's hands, and actually calling for a ceasefire is advancing Hamas's war strategy.
Absolutely, Sharri. I mean, in a time of war, governments have to hold their nerve. It is not the time to try and be all things to all people. And the contradictory and confusing messaging out of this government continues. You've got to hold your nerve. We've got Josh Burns, who's actually on the ground in Israel because the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Prime Minister refuses to go, saying no ceasefire. That is what the Labor MP on the ground in Israel is saying right now, while simultaneously you've got ministers like Ed Husic and Annika Wells saying exactly the opposite. We need a clear message from this government, and you cannot have Hamas being able to rearm, rebuild, reorganise so it continue its desire to exterminate the Jewish population from the Middle East. It's incredible. I cannot believe our government has, again, chosen to be more concerned about their pre-selections and elections, I might say, and appeasing the left wing of their party than actually standing up for what is right, what is democratic, and to be giving tacit approval to the anti-Semitic movement in this country.
Michael Danby, I've been sent photographs today of what I'm told is the Anna Schwartz Gallery in Melbourne, and the front of it has been defaced with anti-Semitic graffiti. This is the problem. You know, the Albanese government continues to lecture, you can see the photographs now on your screen. The Australian government continues to lecture Israel, the implication that Israel's, not doing enough to protect civilian life. And then we see this rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. As you can see in that photograph, the graffiti says we support, you support the murder of babies. It's calling for a boycott of the Schwartz Gallery, saying Zionism is fascism. That's the reality of the Albanese government's position. It's fueling a rise in anti-Semitism. What do you think about that, Michael Danby?
Socialist left government, not a traditional Labor government, a socialist left government that's blind to these hatreds that it's building up by having these ridiculous positions on you're okay to defend yourself from Hamas until you actually do. These people are making for something worse to happen. I mean, you couldn't imagine a nicer group of lefties than the Schwartz family, particularly Anna and Maury. And here they get their gallery daubed by some neo-Nazi pretending to be a far leftist. This is going to get worse and worse in Australia. It's like those university presidents in the United States, Sharri. Until people stand up to them, until Albo and Wong and all of these people stand up to people, including in their government, Husick, Burke and the pro-Palestinian legacy of Bob Carr, then this is just going to go on and on and on. Started with Gas the Jews, which made Australia infamous, and now we're having galleries daubed. Will people be attacked next?
This is what worries me about, kind of, in a way, the Jewish response to all of this. We saw that Maury Schwartz has stepped back from his day-to-day role at his publishing house. He says it's not because of Gaza. That's what he says. We've also seen that a couple of the directors of the Sydney Theatre Company have also resigned because of that protest from Sydney Theatre Company actors. But Bridget, what concerns me is that, I'm grateful for their strength and for their courage, but it means that you don't have people advocating for the Jewish community in the powerful positions, like the directors of the Sydney Theatre Company. So that's what concerns me, that Jews might withdraw from public life in response to this anti-Semitism.
I think that's a rightful concern. You've got two powerful advocates of the arts community here in Australia are being now victims of hate speech. And I think, to Michael's point, where are the police actually not waiting for a complaint to be made, but at some point there are institutions in this democracy that are supposed to uphold the law, not wait to be told to uphold the law. And so I would be asking the police to actually find who did that and prosecute them without being asked to do it. Because I think that then provides the security, if you like, for these Jewish people in our Jewish community to feel safe and feel safe enough to stay where they are and be strong advocates, because otherwise they can't be assured that the institutions that are set around to protect them will actually step in and actually protect them. Because everything we've seen thus far from state governments suggests that there is some ambiguity around this and there needs to be clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I was going to end tonight, we don't have time to play it now, but a far-right Polish lawmaker has used a fire extinguisher to blow out the candles on a menorah, a Chanukiah, inside Parliament. Michael, this is just open anti-Semitism around the world.
Yeah, and it's been fueled by our weakness in standing up to the international coalition of people that hate us. That's appalling to see that in the Polish Parliament. I hope the new government there arrests him. And Bridget's dead right about the police. They haven't arrested one person who was yelling outside our iconic opera house, "Gas the Jews." Exactly. Arrest them. And Eric Beech's crikey is now saying that the whole thing didn't happen. I mean, what an upside-down world we live in.
Yeah, the laws are there. They've got to use them. Michael Danby, Bridget McKenzie, thank you both so much for joining me.
Happy Hanukkah.
And happy Hanukkah to all of you as well, and Merry Christmas. I'll be back tomorrow night at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for watching. James Morrow is filling in for Peter Credlin after the break.